There are faces we forget with time, and others that return to us in the quiet hours, carved into the softest corners of memory like old wounds that never fully close. At 83, Vanessa Redgrave sits in a dim room overlooking the Thames, her silhouette framed against the fading winter light. She has lived a life overflowing with applause, fame, and the relentless glow of cameras. Yet the silence around her tonight feels heavier than any spotlight she has ever stood under. It is in this silence that she finally whispers a confession she has withheld for decades. At my age, she murmurs, her voice thin but steady, I can name 5 people who scarred my heart, and I have never forgiven them. The words fall slowly, like dust shaken from a forgotten book. Her hands tremble slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of what is about to be unveiled. For the world, Vanessa Redgrave is a legend. Majestic, untouchable, almost carved from theater itself. But legends bleed too, and the deeper the love poured into a life, the deeper the wounds carved by betrayal, abandonment, or silence. She closes her eyes for a long moment as if searching through the corridors of her past, brushing against names she once tried to bury. The room seems to tighten around her, the air thick with memory and the faint echo of unresolved sorrow. 5 faces, 5 turning points, 5 shadows standing quietly behind a lifetime of brilliance. But who are they? These 5 people she could never forgive. The room remains still, as if holding its breath while Vanessa lets her memories rise. To understand the 5 names she carries in silence, one must first walk back with her, far beyond the theaters, the awards, the ovations, to the narrow English streets where her story began. Because no wound appears fully formed, every scar has a childhood shadow behind it. She was born on a cold January day in 1937 in Blackheath, London, into a family where artistry was not a choice, but an inheritance. Her father, Michael Redgrave, moved through the world like a distant comet, brilliant, admired, and rarely within reach. Her mother, Rachel Kempson, soft-spoken yet resilient, tried to keep the home stitched together, even as the storms of theater life tore through their walls. Vanessa grew up watching people leave, actors who drifted from show to show, friends who disappeared at the end of each season, and sometimes even her own parents, swallowed by rehearsals and uncertainty. As a child, she learned early that applause was loud, but absence was louder. There were evenings when she sat alone by the radio, listening to static hum between stations, imagining that each crackle was a message from someone who had forgotten to come home. She learned to wait without expecting, to love without demanding, to stand firm even when the ground beneath her shifted. And though she did not yet know it, the seeds of unforgiven memories were already being planted, quietly, invisibly. Her father's emotional distance carved the first hollow inside her. She adored him, yet could never fully reach him. His silences, more than his words, shaped her understanding of affection, fragile, unpredictable, often withheld. Her mother's endurance taught her strength, but also taught her that love sometimes meant swallowing hurt without protest. In these early years, Vanessa discovered the protective weight of solitude. She built inner worlds from stories, shadows, and stage lights. She learned that vulnerability had a cost, and trust was never guaranteed. Those who disappointed her, sometimes unintentionally, left small fractures she carried into adulthood. And so, long before fame, before heartbreak, before betrayal, a quiet certainty settled in her bones. Some wounds would never be forgiven because they were woven into the very beginning of her life. The years passed, and the little girl who once listened to the radio's static grew into a young woman shaped by resolve, instinct, and a fierce, almost sacred devotion to her craft. Vanessa stepped onto the stage for the first time, as if returning to a place she had always belonged. She moved with a quiet confidence, born not from arrogance, but from the need to speak in a world where her childhood had been filled with silence. Theater became her true inheritance, a space where she could finally breathe, cry, break, and rebuild beneath beams of light rather than behind closed doors. By the early 1960s, she was no longer simply the daughter of the Redgraves. She was Vanessa, unmistakable, luminous, her presence commanding both reverence and curiosity. Roles came quickly: Shakespearean heroines, radical women, characters who demanded emotional truth rather than performance. Directors admired her intuition. Audiences leaned forward when she appeared, instinctively aware that something rare was unfolding. Fame wrapped around her like a spotlight that never turned off. Yet behind the applause, small tremors began to shake her world. Success, she discovered, attracted not only admiration, but envy, rivalry, and silent expectations. The higher she rose, the more precarious the air became. She smiled for cameras, but her gaze often wandered, searching for honesty in a world built on masks. Those early fractures from childhood resurfaced, not as faint lines, but as vulnerabilities others could exploit. By the 1970s, Vanessa Redgrave had become an international icon. Oscar nominations, renowned stage productions, political activism that intensified both her legacy and her controversies. She was bold, uncompromising. But boldness came with a price. Colleagues whispered behind closed doors, tabloids sharpened their knives, and those she trusted sometimes mistook her openness for weakness. Fame revealed a truth she had sensed since childhood. People leave, people change, people betray, sometimes quietly, sometimes spectacularly. There were moments when she stood behind the curtain, hearing the roar of an audience waiting for her entrance, yet feeling utterly alone. The applause felt distant, as if echoing through a long corridor, rather than landing in her chest. For all the brilliance she offered, she received shadows in return. Broken promises, half-truths, and emotional debts others never repaid. And somewhere along this ascent, the first real cracks in her adult life began to appear. A partner whose devotion dimmed, a friend whose loyalty faltered, a colleague whose ambition cut deeper than a blade. These were the first betrayals that marked her. Not yet the 5 names she would never forgive, but unmistakable warnings. The higher she climbed, the more she understood that the greatest wounds often came from those who stood closest to her. In her brightest years, Vanessa Redgrave learned the cruel paradox of fame. The more the world embraced her, the more her heart became exposed. Open to admiration, yes, but also to the quiet, devastating blows that would one day define the 5 faces engraved in her memory. Success had lifted her high, but it was in the private corners of her life that the first deep ruptures formed. Quietly at first, then with a force she could no longer ignore. Vanessa had always given herself fully to the people she loved. Family, partners, collaborators, friends who felt like extensions of her own soul. Yet it was precisely in these intimate spaces that the ground shifted beneath her feet. The first fracture came unexpectedly, in a moment of raw honesty she had not anticipated. Someone she trusted, someone whose presence had once softened the hardest days, chose ambition over loyalty. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, no grand betrayal. It was a decision made in silence. A door closed softly, an absence where warmth had once been. And for Vanessa, silence had always cut deeper than words. She felt the old wounds of childhood stir, reminding her that those she let close could vanish without warning. The second rupture was more violent. A conflict played out under the scrutiny of the world. Criticism sharpened like knives, aimed not only at her work, but at her convictions, her identity, her very existence as an artist who dared to speak. The press twisted her intentions, colleagues distanced themselves, and people she had supported in their darkest hours stood still while she was left to weather the storm alone. Betrayal, she realized, was rarely a single act. It was the accumulation of small abandonments, gestures withheld, truths avoided. Then came the rupture that cut straight to the bone, a personal loss that left her hollow, breathless, unable to make sense of the world for months. Someone she loved deeply slipped away, through time, through circumstance, through the slow erosion of connection that neither of them could repair. It wasn't anger she felt then, but a sorrow so complete it numbed her. And hidden beneath that sorrow was a bitterness she tried to deny. She did not forgive easily. She never had. Each betrayal deepened a line inside her, carving a map of emotional scars she carried into every new role, every new relationship. And as the years unfolded, these wounds intertwined with her legacy, visible not on her skin, but in the quiet of her gaze, the tremor in her voice when she spoke of the past. Since then, she has kept their names, 5 faces, 5 histories, etched into the shadows of her memory. 5 names, 5 wounds, 5 moments in Vanessa Redgrave's long life, where the world shifted so abruptly that the echoes never faded. She speaks of them slowly now, each one surfacing like a ghost she has tried to outrun but never escaped. These are not accusations. She has long passed the hunger for blame. They are instead the truth she carries, the scars that shaped her heart. The first person was someone she once loved gently, almost naively, in the soft, uncertain years before fame hardened her. He was a young actor too, handsome in a trembling sort of way, full of promises made by candlelight and dreams whispered after long rehearsals. Their romance was fragile, a quiet refuge from the chaos of aspiring careers. But fragility, she learned, is easily crushed. One evening, she discovered he had chosen another path, another person, without the courage to look her in the eyes. No explanation, no apology. His final message to her was a silence as sharp as a blade. It was a small betrayal in the great span of her life, but it was the first time she felt love tear instead of hold. She never forgave him, not for leaving, but for disappearing. The second person arrived in her life suddenly, wrapped in admiration that later revealed its darker side. He was older, powerful in their world, a director whose praise opened doors but whose bitterness eventually tried to shut them on her. At first, he championed her brilliance. Later, he envied it. A single disagreement, subtle, private, unraveled into a quiet campaign against her reputation. Roles she had been promised slipped away. Collaborators hesitated. She learned then how dangerous wounded egos could be. What hurt her wasn't the loss of opportunities, but the realization that respect could turn to rivalry without warning. She carried that betrayal for years, hidden beneath professionalism. She never forgave him, not for what he took, but for tainting her trust in mentorship. The third person was someone far closer, someone whose absence she has never fully spoken of. They shared blood, history, and a lineage heavy with expectation. She loved them fiercely with the unconditional devotion only family can demand. But in a moment when she needed understanding, when her life's weight had become almost unbearable, they chose distance. Not out of malice, perhaps out of fear, confusion, or their own wounds. But the result was the same. She faced her darkest season alone. Their silence that year carved the deepest fissure in her. Family betrayals do not shout, they whisper, and their echoes last the longest. She never forgave them, not because they failed her, but because she had believed they never would. The fourth person was not a single individual at all. It was the public, the critics, the faceless chorus who judged her convictions louder than her art. During one of the most turbulent periods of her career, when political storms wrapped around her name like wildfire, the world turned its back with a swiftness that stunned her. Headlines distorted her beliefs. Commentators sharpened her identity into caricature. People she had once moved with her performances now condemned her without listening. She stood on stage in one performance, hearing not applause but a strange, palpable hostility, an invisible wall between her and the world she had given her life to. She never forgave that moment, not because they disagreed with her, but because they refused to see her as human. And then there is the fifth. For a long time, she avoided speaking of this final wound. She believed it belonged in the quiet, not the light. But now at 83, she understands that some truth must be spoken to lose their power. The fifth person, the one she has never forgiven, is herself, not for the choices she made, but for the choices she didn't. For the moments when fear stopped her from loving fully, for the anger she carried too long, the apologies she never voiced, the bridges she allowed to burn because pride felt safer than vulnerability. She remembers years lost to stubbornness, to grief she refused to release, to battles she fought alone because she believed she had to. I was hardest on myself, she admits softly, and that is the wound that never healed. In the end, the 5 faces she holds in memory form a single truth. The deepest scars are not inflicted in dramatic scenes, but in the quiet fractures of trust, love, and self-forgiveness. The room has grown darker now, as if the day itself were folding gently around her words. Vanessa sits quietly, her hands resting on her lap, the lines on her skin illuminated by the last thin ray of evening light. There is no bitterness in her voice anymore, only a weary tenderness, the kind that comes when a lifetime finally exhales. She has carried these 5 names for decades, their weight shifting but never disappearing, shaping her choices as an artist, a mother, a woman who learned to stand alone without ever wishing to be lonely. She knows she cannot rewrite the past. She cannot return to that first young love or reclaim the friendships lost to ambition. She cannot erase the silence of family or the sting of public judgment. And she cannot undo the years in which she demanded perfection of herself when all she needed was grace. What remains now is not anger, but understanding. A quiet acknowledgement that every wound, forgiven or not, has led her to this moment of clarity. Outside, the river moves steadily, indifferent to memory. Inside, Vanessa closes her eyes as if offering a final salute to the ghost she has named at last. The house settles, the evening deepens, and her voice falls to a whisper barely above breath. "We carry what we cannot forgive," she says, "not because we want to, but because it teaches us who we truly are." Then silence returns, soft, unbroken, almost gentle, and the lingering questions rise like smoke in the dim light. Can a life be complete without forgiveness? Or do we sometimes need our pain to remember that we once loved deeply?